Sometimes economists specifically want to focus on what happens to an aggregate level of prices from one year to another. In order to do this, economists defined the concept of the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator, simply put, is just the nominal GDP in a given year divided by the real GDP in a given year times 100. Here we can see, if we consider nominal GDP as we've defined it to be some measure of aggregate price level times real output, and real GDP is just that Y, or that real output in and of itself, what we get out of this is we see that our GDP deflator is just P times Y, which is our nominal GDP, divided by Y, which is our real GDP, times 100, or even simpler, P times 100. So we can see from here very clearly that our GDP deflator represents some measure of the aggregate nominal price level in an economy. We can use the GDP numbers that we calculated in our previous example to think about how we would go about calculating our GDP deflator. So for example here, we said that 2011 was our base year. And you'll notice in the base year, nominal GDP and real GDP are in fact the same thing. So for 2011, our GDP deflator is just 400 over 400 times 100, which just gives us 100. And what you'll notice is that because nominal and real GDP in the base year are the same, the GDP deflator for the base year is always going to be 100. In contrast, we can calculate the GDP deflator for 2012 by again taking nominal GDP in 2012, which is 650, and dividing that by real GDP in 2012, which is 495, and multiplying that by 100. And what we get is that this is, rounding to two decimal places, 1.31 times 100, or 131. So if we're thinking about our GDP deflator as a measure or an index of an overall price level, as we said here, that our GDP deflator was just some measure of the price level times 100, then if we get bigger numbers for our GDP deflator, that means that prices are increasing. So for example, because we got a bigger GDP deflator for 2012 than we got for 2011, that means that prices on average increased from 2011 to 2012. If we had gotten a number smaller than 100 here, that would have indicated that prices on average or in the aggregate decreased from 2011 to 2012. Because we've defined the GDP deflator to be a measure of an aggregate price level in an economy, we can even use the GDP deflator to calculate one measure of inflation, which is just the change in the aggregate price level from one period to the next. So for example, from one year to the next. Here we've defined those years as year 1 and year 2. So we can say that the inflation, or one measure of inflation, from year 1 to year 2 is just the percent change in the GDP deflator, because inflation is in and of itself defined as a percent change in the aggregate price level. And again, the percent change in the GDP deflator is going to be the GDP deflator for year 2 minus the GDP deflator for year 1 divided by the GDP deflator for year 1 and just multiplied by 100%. So taking the example that we've been working with, the GDP deflator in year 2 was about 131. The GDP deflator in year 1, or 2011, was by definition 100 because it was the base year. So we divide again by that base year GDP deflator, which is 100, and then multiply by 100%. This is just going to give us 0.31 times 100%, which is 31%. So we can see that our inflation from year 1, which we said was 2011, to year 2, which in our example is 2012, is in fact 31%. Because we can see that there was a 31% increase in our aggregate price level, which is represented by this concept of the GDP deflator.